So why don't we get started? So as developers, we spend hours, weeks, months obsessing over details of our applications. We worry about transitions and beautiful animations in our applications, creating the perfect user experience, and making sure that when we deliver that app, everybody loves it. It runs amazingly and perfectly on every single device. But once we've built the application, what do we actually do with it? So how many folks here, just by a quick show of hands, have actually deployed an application out via any kind of public app store, enterprise distribution, or anything? Okay, so a good handful of folks. How many of you folks actually thought that was a delightful or pleasant experience? Yeah, not a lot of people are raising their hands for that. Deploying applications onto environments is complex, but it's not hard. When you know the right steps to go through for each one of the platforms, it's actually a fairly simple process. You just need to find the repeatable steps and make sure you've got the right files in place, all of the right moves. So my name is David Hathaway. I'm a customer success engineer here at Xamarin. I work in our enterprise space, so focusing on our customers who are building more than just your single application where it's going out via, say, a public app store, but actually working with organizations who are developing mobile strategies, so building potentially tens and if not hundreds of applications, and they need robust ways to manage that entire pipeline. So as we talk about with distribution, there's primarily two main ways to get an application out onto individual devices. The first is the public app store. And the public app stores are great for users because they're very low friction. Users already know how to use this. You just say, go to the app store and search for such and such, and there's your actual application. So very low friction, very consumer friendly. But the reality is that for a lot of enterprise distribution, because it is public, there's just some difficulties like subject to approval. So I've talked with a number of folks that have been here that have had to pad their development schedule with, say, a 2 or 3 week lag time. They have to say, okay, my development actually needs to be done 3 weeks before I actually want this to go into the App Store because I'm afraid my app might get rejected 1 or more times, and that can take, I've heard, 2 weeks before just to even get your application rejected, and then you submit it again. And there's no management when you do this approach, so it's just a blast. You put it out there, anybody who wants to come and install the application is able to. So that really makes for not a very good and sustainable way for enterprises to actually manage their application deployment. So the other side of the fence is ad hoc and enterprise app store distribution. And in this case, you're able to control a lot more about where your application is installed, who has access to it, and your apps are less likely to be hacked because they're not out in the public domain. And as we see time and time again, applications are throwing up on third-party app stores, even in iOS. This happens on a fairly regular basis. So you want to make sure that your apps are not going out to people that shouldn't ever get their hands on it. The cons of this approach is it's a little bit of additional work up front. But again, once you've set that up, it makes it a much easier process. So we're going to talk about that today. Before we talk about the actual distribution part, we're going to talk a little bit about the signing process on each one of the platforms, because that's really where a lot of folks go through the most pain in their distribution process is how do I even get this package to a point where I can put it on my actual devices, where I can put it in some kind of an app store. And so that starts with a tool called Keytool. Keytool is part of the Java runtime or the Java SDKs. And what Keytool does is it actually generates a Keystore. And the Keystore is used to actually sign the application, give it a digital signature so that you know who the application is being signed by. Now, with the Keystore, you specify alias name and password that secures the Keystore so anybody can't actually access it if they don't know how. And you put in your information about who you are and what your organization is. You can use GUIs. So we have built into both Visual Studio and Xamarin Studio tools to generate these key stores. When you do the archiving process, it'll give you the option to do that. But when you're doing, say, a continuous integration build or continuous delivery, you want to make sure that you're generating these files ahead of time. And so there's also command line tools to do that. Again, it's going to accept what's the key store that you actually want to distribute. So that's just the name of the file. The alias of the key store, so we saw that the first part, when you'll use that in the signing process to tell the key store, in fact, how do you actually want, what part do you want to use to sign it. And then, again, the information about the person, who are you, and what are you, what organization, where are you located, so that people can actually say, who did this application come from, and do I trust this person to put apps onto my device? Once you've done the key tool, the next piece is actually signing the application. That's applying that certificate, that Keystore that you created in the first step, to the actual APK file. So jar signer takes in, as we mentioned, the Keystore from the previous step. The next parameter is the actual APK that you want to apply the Keystore to. Then finally, the alias that we created and the output file that we actually want to have. So now this is your signed certificate. And again, jar signer is also part of the actual Java SDK. And so there's one more step that you have to do. In part, it's because it gives you better performance on Android, but Xamarin Android applications, if you haven't run this last step, will actually fail to start. We do a check when applications start up within the Mono runtime to make sure you've run this zip-align command. And what zip-align does is it aligns your application into 4-byte sections, so it makes it much faster to load. For a Xamarin-based application, you actually have to do it. For Android apps, it may just be slower. So you take in your signed application, and then finally, the actual aligned application. And this is now your final output. This is the file that you can now take and put up into your enterprise app store to distribute. Before we talk about actual distribution mechanisms, let's go through the other two platforms. So the Windows Store app signing, as well, then we'll follow with iOS app signing. So for Windows Store app signing, there's actually a number of places where you could get a certificate from. You might have a cert file that you've gotten from some other kind of certificate authority, like a Symantec, and there's many out there. So you might have a root certificate you've been using to sign applications. You can use that. You can also create self-signed certificates. So maybe you're distributing within an enterprise, and you don't necessarily need to go out and get a certificate, a root certificate that's going to be known to the outside world. And you can distribute that certificate along the way. So we'll take a look at what is the actual process there. And the basic steps are pretty much the same you're going to see across each of the platforms. It's just that for each one of the platforms, the tools that you use and the inputs are slightly different, but it's basically the same process. So after you use make cert, you're going to use a tool called PVK to PFX, and that generates what's called your personal exchange file. So make cert is the utility that actually generates the certificate itself and what's called your PVK file or private key file. So as part of your input to your make cert file, you pass in all the same information that we just put in your Keystore, your Android Keystore. So your organization, the application name, what group you're within, and your location, et cetera. There's some additional parameters that define things like whether or not it's a self-signed certificate and what types of encryption hash you want to apply to it. And then finally, what is your output PVK file, the private key file. And these two files that we generate are actually inputs to the next tool, which creates your personal information file. And the personal information file is what you use to actually sign the application. So we take in our PVK file, followed by our certificate file, and then the output file, our actual PFX file. And of course, we have to give that a password so that it's encrypted, it's protected, that other folks can't come and just use that. And the tool that applies, just like we had jar signer for Android, for the Windows space, we have a tool called Sign Tool. And Sign Tool takes in the PFX file as well as the password, so you can unlock the PFX file. A lot of acronyms in this presentation. And then ultimately your AppX file. So this might be an AppX file, it might be a Zap file, it might be an AppX bundle. It depends on which platform you're distributing to. So in terms of the signing process, you can, in a general way, think about these things as pretty much the same thing. It's just a matter of if it's a Silverlight style application, the file extension will be Zap. If it's one of the newish Windows 8 or 8.1, it's going to be AppX. And then for the Windows 10 universal applications, you get the AppX bundle file name. For signing, as far as the signing and distribution process goes, you can really kind of consider those things all the same thing. So iOS signing. This one's a little bit different. Apple is obviously, we've all heard it in the news lately, very concerned about security. They take the security of the end users' phones and devices and all of your data very, very seriously. So when you're signing with Apple, there's actually, so you have to do things a little bit differently. Again, you're creating all of the same kinds of things. Instead of a key store to sign or a personal information file, you create what's called a provisioning profile. But you have to do all of this within Apple's tools. You can't just generate these files anywhere you want to, so you have to have an Apple Enterprise account. Also, make sure if you're an organization you don't have an Apple Enterprise account, make sure you go and do that, because that process does take a little bit of time. You have to submit things like your Dun & Bradstreet number of your organization. You have to prove that you're an actual company. Individuals can't just go sign up for enterprise app accounts. So do that a little bit ahead of time. Plan that into your application development process to make sure that that's all taken care of for you. But within the Apple Developer Portal, you have your certificates, identifiers, and profile section, and that's where you actually create the files that you're going to use. So in the examples with Android and with the Windows platforms, we did that all just locally on our workstations. We just install the developer tools, and everything that we need is right there. Within the iOS world, we actually have to do all of those things up in the portal. So first, we define who is going to get this application. The next thing we define is what application is actually going to be signed by this particular certificate. And then lastly, where is that actual certificate going to be applied? So again, you can't just say, well, I'll give you your application, and we'll give you the certificate. We'll just put all of those things on your device. You actually need to run this through Apple's process. And so starting with the who, so to speak, that's where you generate your signing certificate. Your signing certificate, again, it's just authenticating who am I? Who's the person that's trying to put an application on my device? And when you actually install the app on your device, the user will have to allow that management, that enterprise distribution certificate, to be used on that particular device. It's actually a volunteer or an opt-in process, so the user has to go in there. So again, I believe it was with iOS 9, starting with iOS 9, that process, when you install the certificate, you actually still have to go to the certificate in your settings and trust the certificate. So it's actually a secondary manual step. Previous versions, you just said, please install this certificate, and everything was good to go. Once you've created the certificate, you're going to create what's called your app ID. And the app ID allows you to actually apply your certificate to the application, and that matches up to your bundle identifier. So every application has a unique bundle identifier. It's how the app stores know and the devices know, has this application already been installed on my device? Now, in your app ID, you can actually use things like wildcards. So you can just put a star in here and use one single app ID for every single application, and developers do that a lot of times just to not have to mess around with lots of different certificates. You probably want to be careful about that. This is not an official recommendation, just general guidance. You probably want to be careful about that, because if anybody gets a hold of that signing certificate and your application ID, they can sign any application they want with your organization and just start distributing. So the best practice is probably to, at least for any applications that you're going to use for distribution purposes, to make sure that you're specifying the exact bundle ID in here. And we didn't see this step with the other two platforms, with Android and with iOS. We didn't have to do anything specific to the application to say this app is allowed to do these functions. With iOS, there's actually yet another layer of connection between the actual signing process and the application itself. So you're going to define, in any of the individual platforms, you define the permissions that the app is allowed to do. Can it go out to the internet? Can it get my geolocation? Can I access my media devices and so forth? But that's specific to the application. And you do that in your iOS app, but you also have to specify this in the actual app ID, because Apple is going to check these things. It's going to go to the server and say, do you or do you not have permission to do this? So it might be something like app groups. Maybe you've got a watch app that's going to share data with your actual phone or some other kind of an extension, or you just have multiple apps within your device that you've got a suite of applications that all want to access the same stored data. Another example of that would be something like HealthKit, and what self-respecting application doesn't support push notifications, so you have to enable those. Or maybe in the enterprise space, we're seeing more and more customers are wanting to use private VPNs. So they want their applications to actually authenticate through their VPN to access internal enterprise resources. It's seamless to the user. They don't have to go and start up a separate VPN application. So again, these are all the things you have to build in, otherwise your app's not going to have the permission to do those things. Once you've created the actual app and the app ID, you can go in and actually generate the provisioning profile. And this is finally the piece that you would then use to actually sign the application. And so what it does is it marries your application. So here you can see in the dropdown, this dropdown only shows the list of apps that have been created in that previous page that we just looked at, and then the certificates that are actually available for you to use for signing. So by tying these two things together, I've now informed Apple that I intend to actually distribute something with this bundle identifier, these permissions, and this certificate onto individual devices. One really quick note here, this is just kind of a public service announcement because I've struggled with this many times before. It's one of the things you forget about for like 6 months and then you come back and do it again. And you always end up having to find somebody because it's not really well documented. For distribution certificates, you can't just go in and just pull those certificates down into your machine. They're a little bit different than, say, your developer certificates. What you actually have to do is get those from the machine that it was originally created on. So you can export this file and bring that over to other machines that you intend to do builds on. Otherwise, you'll see the top part here, which says the iPhone distribution profile. So if you go into the app developer portal and go to the certificate section, you can click download, and you saw that in one of the previous slides. You download, and it only downloads the certificate, that first item that's highlighted in blue there. What it's missing is the private key, and the private key comes from the workstation where the certificate was actually created. So you'll go mad, you'll be banging your head against the table, you'll be Googling everything, you will never find the answer to this question, and then you'll realize once you figure it out, which is I didn't get that certificate, that you read like 12 documents that told you exactly what was wrong, and you just ignored all of them. But so just keep that in mind, that you need to have that on the machine that's actually performing your build. And so just like the previous platforms, there's tools for actually applying things. Apple has a utility. It's part of the Xcode toolchain. It's called Codesign that allows you to specify the application you're signing, what are the entitlements, and your certificate, and so forth. Now, Codesign, you're going to find, if you Google Codesign, you're not going to find a lot of examples of actually using Codesign. What you'll find is a lot of utilities and scripts that have been built around Codesign because it's kind of unpleasant to use if you're using it from a command line interface. So the best way to sign your applications is to just, wherever you're building the app, specify in your project settings, your Xamarin iOS project settings, the actual certificate you want to use for your release device builds, and we'll just do it for you. It's kind of the easiest way to do it. But there are some third-party tools and scripts that folks have written to simplify the process a little bit. And so good. So now we're actually to the point where we can distribute. So we've got an AppX bundle, we've got an APK, and we've got an IPA file that we can actually put onto the individual devices. So if we go back to our distribution mechanisms, we're going to focus on the right-hand side, which is this ad hoc and enterprise distribution. And for myself, and this isn't an official diagram, this is just how I personally kind of internalize the concept of what's the difference between an ad hoc and an enterprise distribution. I view enterprise distribution as going out to the masses of your organization. So I'm going to allow this on many devices, potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of devices, depending on how large your organization is. Whereas ad hoc distribution is more of, I want to put an app on a given device. So ad hoc distribution you would typically use for things like beta testing or QA. You might have maybe a preview release that you only want a select set of users to have access to. And the challenge with ad hoc is that with iOS at least, you actually need to collect the device identifier and specify that in the Apple developer portal. So you have to collect that information from each device that you want to put it on. So it doesn't scale very well, and on top of that, you can only have in your Apple developer portal up to, I believe it's 100 devices registered within a 1-year period, and they don't let you delete devices, or they do, but only once a year. So you can't go in, add a device, remove a device, add a device, remove a device. So if you're not careful, you can chew up your allocation of devices in the Apple developer portal very, very quickly, and then you're out of devices. You can't add anyone new within that enterprise subscription until it becomes a time to actually clear those out. And the last thing you need to do is ready your individual devices to actually accept applications. So again, it's not just as simple as we can download a file onto the device and install like we've been doing with Windows or Mac environments for a very long time. For each one of the platforms, there's a place in the operating system where you have to actually go in and allow applications that do not come from the public app stores to be signed. So in Android, that's under Settings and Security. There's a section that says Unknown Sources. Depending on your Android distribution, this might be called something else, or it might be located in a slightly different place. So just take a look around within, Google it a little bit if you can't seem to find it. Some of the ones like Samsung devices who have more dramatically changed the user experience over the top, it might be in a slightly different place. But it's there, I promise. Every Android device has the ability to do this. On the Windows devices, there's two options actually inside Windows devices, and one is meant to be for more of the enterprise distribution scenario, and the other is meant for more of the developer mode, and it should be fairly obvious which ones those are. So if you're just doing distribution, you want to just select the sideload option, and developer mode gives you the sideload capability that you can actually push apps onto your devices, but it also gives you more diagnostic capabilities to actually, say, debug against that device from Visual Studio. And lastly, in iOS, you're going to see the actual device management certificate, and this is under, I think, General. So go to Settings in General, and there's scroll way, way, way down. If you have a certificate, you'll see a section that says Device Management. And if you tap on that certificate and it hasn't been allowed, it will say trust this certificate. The user actually has to go and trust that certificate. Otherwise, when you try to run an application on a device where you haven't trusted it yet, you can't actually start the application. So it will say you have an enterprise cert that hasn't been trusted yet. Please go into your settings and trust that certificate. So how do we actually put the apps onto the devices? How do we get everything out there? So we said the public app stores aren't really a good option for a number of reasons. One, you don't want your enterprise intellectual property out in the public app stores, at least not all of it. Some of it might be appropriate for that, but not all of it. So there's varying ways, and it's kind of the friction meets capabilities. So how low do you want the friction to be to install versus how much control do you want to have about how you can actually distribute your applications? So if we're distributing via email and links, it's like the public app store in the sense that I put an app out there. Whether I just send an email to my users and there's literally either an AppX or an APK file in the email, and you can do that. You can actually just email an app to people and they can install it on their devices. Or you can just put it up on your public intranet site or just a link to a Dropbox file. It could come from pretty much anywhere. And the user can click the link, download it to their device, and actually install it. For iOS, it's a little bit different. We'll look at that in just a second, how you actually go ahead and do that distribution. So distributing via an app link, let's cut over here really quickly to my individual devices. Distributing via an app link actually is as simple, all I did was file new MVC project. And so once I'm inside the browser on each one of these devices, I can just say this is just HTML. Here is my Android version of my application. I'm going to click the install button. I just click OK. It's going to download. I'll just replace that file. And for iOS, I do the same thing. So I just click install. So iOS has a little bit of a different process here. So it's actually going to ask me, do I want to install this application on my device? And behind the scenes now, because I was in Safari, you do need to be in Safari, and that's one of those things. You're going to wonder why, when I'm using things like Hockey App or some kind of an enterprise management solution, why do I keep ending up back in Safari? I have this mobile website that's not really ideal. The reason for that is because you have to open these links from Safari. It's another security measure that Apple puts in place. So now we see that our application is actually installed on the device itself, and our Android app will actually install there as well. Really quick, let's switch over to my Windows environment and actually take a look. What does that code look like? Because this is really fairly simple to actually set up on your individual device. I'll wait here for my wrong password to not sign me in, and then we'll switch over. So as I mentioned here, we have just a simple MVC project. And in my controller here, we had the websites up so you could take a look at those earlier. I just have hyperlinks. Now my iOS hyperlink has this weird prefix at the beginning, this ITMS services. Let me bump that up in size just a little bit so it's a little easier for folks to see in the back of the room. I'll go down here to my drop down because this is a really sensitive. So this ITMS services, this is a route for iOS. iOS has a concept of routes, so if you want to do inter-app communication and you want to do the open URL command, this route defines the iOS operating system that I'm trying to invoke an app install on my device. I'm saying I want to download that application, and then I have this manifest and the URL to the actual manifest file itself. So again, the manifest file is just an info plist file that defines where is your actual APK that you're installing. And if we come over to actually take a look at the manifest file, it's fairly simple. There's not a lot to this, but this gives me the string to my actual IPA file that I signed that we created earlier in this process. Now keep in mind, or at least I've observed in the latest releases, this does need to come from an HTTPS certificate. It can't actually come from a come from an HTTP certificate or iOS will complain. And now I'm going to make sure that this is plugged in so my computer doesn't shut off. There we go. So for your iOS application, you do have to use this special URL, this syntax here, which points to that info plist, or excuse me, the manifest plist file. And you have to prefix it with that special link so that iOS knows when I click on this, I don't want to just open this in a new tab. I don't want to just change my URL. I actually want to fire off another message to another app within the operating system. As I scroll down and look at the applications for my Windows Universal app, which we also have in this as well, there's a Universal app. You can see this is just a link to a file that I just download. I'll extract that file on my device and then run the installer. And the same for the APK file. This is just, again, just hosted on my Dropbox instance. It could be coming from anywhere. It could be coming from your IIS server. It could be coming from a public network share. You can really grab it from pretty much anywhere. So I have my APK file. So it's very easy to stand this up in kind of a one-off fashion. And if you have scenarios where you just need to get the app out there, and it's really quick and dirty, you don't want to stand up a big complex infrastructure, it's very easy to just go put this up. It's just HTML. There's nothing complicated about it. And you can stand that up very, very quickly. It could be in a SharePoint site or whatever collaboration tool you use to do your intranet. So that's how I stood this particular site up so that we could do our distribution there. So we talked about the cons of that approach, though. There's no management. You can't actually see who's installed the application. I guess maybe you could put in something like a Google Analytics and actually track downloads and things like that. We don't know who's installed the application. You don't know what version they've installed. You don't have any feedback back to you. You don't even know if they have installed it. So you send the link out. Everybody gets it. They ignore it, or they archive it, or they just forget it. It just gets lost in their email thread. And people don't actually install the app. And maybe worse, you've got a new version of the application. It's got a major security flaw, or there's a bug that's totally thrashing all of the data on your server. And you need to get that fix out to users. You need them to know that it's out there, and maybe you actually want to force them to install the version of the application. This method doesn't give you any capabilities to do that. So use it sparingly. You probably don't want to use it all the time. You don't want it to be your primary way that you're putting apps out for users to actually install on their devices. But if you just need a really quick and dirty scenario, maybe a limited audience or an app that's only going to live for a certain period of time, that can be one way that you can actually do it. The next way you can do that is with beta app distribution programs. Probably the two that most people are aware of or are using are Hockey App and TestFlight. So TestFlight is Apple's proprietary one, or they purchased a company called TestFlight. TestFlight is iOS specific, whereas Hockey App provides support for all of the Windows platforms for iOS and for Android. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. In addition, these utilities often have value-add functions. So Hockey App, along with Xamarin Insights, as we learned these two products are being combined. This gives you things like crash reporting, version control. You can actually, if you have something like the Hockey App SDK inside your application, as an administrator, you can say, please notify in the app all of my users to let them know that there's in fact a new version of the application. So giving you more control than just an email to go out, actually giving them a notification inside the application that there's a new version of the app. Again, you can see version information. You can see you can have multiple versions managing things, control who has access to what. Hockey App is a hosted solution, and it ties directly into your Microsoft account, whether that be Office 365 or any other kind of standard account. So let's come over and take a look at what is actually inside. What does Hockey App look like in the actual UI? So Hockey App, you first get your dashboard, and the dashboard just gives you all of your applications that are actually distributed. And when you drill into an individual application, you see that you're getting things like your version information. So we saw that James actually has uploaded several versions over the last probably week and a half, 2 weeks, of the iOS Evolve app as we were doing some beta testing. We can see how many downloads of those applications actually occurred, how many crashes were happening inside those applications, and get some other user metrics around sessions, crashes per day, and so forth of the various applications. And what we can also get is, say, feedback, so users can actually publish feedback on how the application is actually working, or their bugs, and what users are actually using the application. But the feature that we care about right now is this private page, this download and feedback private page. And so on our devices, we can notify users that this page exists, and they can go there, much like my intranet page that I just created. It's just an HTML page people can go to, but it offers, like I said, the built-in authentication, and when I distribute the app, I can say which users have access to this, which ones don't. So if we come back over here to our individual devices, we can see here, I will go ahead and uninstall this application on both devices. my 3D touch will cooperate with my finger. I still haven't gotten used to 3D touch. Then we'll come back over to the Hockey app download page on each one of these devices. So we see we get a nice download page. And we get more information than I was previously getting in the page that I stood up. Now, of course, I could build all this stuff, and I'm like any other developer. It's like, how hard could this be? I could just build this. You don't want to build all this stuff. You want to focus on building the applications that your business actually needs and that make a difference for you. So you can see all of your release notes. You can see which versions are supported. I can see a history of applications. So if for some reason I need to go back, maybe you pushed me a beta distribution that's just totally and utterly broken. You didn't run it through Test Cloud. You had no idea that it just didn't work on this device. So you can go back and users can actually opt to install an older version of the application, or you can directly leave feedback for the developers about some issue that you've had in the application. Of course, again, if you have the SDK installed, users can do it from directly inside the mobile app itself. So really trying to drive that mean time to resolution. But the user, all they have to do, they come to the details section. Again, they just click install. It's going to try to install the application here. It's going to download onto the given devices. So for Android, again, it's just another mechanism of downloading the actual file. So we'll go through here. We can see that my app is actually installing now on my iOS device. And again, when it completes downloading, I'll get prompted on my Android device to distribute that as well. So we get a little bit more control over who can install the app and when they can install it. But we still don't have really that granular enterprise management of the application. So even with this approach, we put the app out there and we can never take it back. And we also can't require people to install the application. So sometimes as an organization, you need people to have very specific apps on their devices. You want to force them to actually install those applications. And that's where things like enterprise application management solutions come in. There's many of those solutions that are deployed across lots of different organizations. Obviously, Microsoft has the Intune product for that functionality. There's companies like AirWatch, Citrix, Good Technology, excuse me, and more. There's plenty of them out there. These tools, they kind of step up the game. So they have a lot of functionality that you're going to get with your beta app distribution in terms of all of the enterprise app store functionality, but they also offer you a lot more management capabilities. So maybe a device gets lost or stolen, you can actually go remove those applications off of those devices. Or as we said, you can segment and say these users are allowed to install this app, these other users have to install this app. Or take the case earlier, there's a bug in the application causing any of a number of problems. I can actually go and pull that application off of that individual user's device to avoid it from creating any more issues. Maybe I need to say every single device, I have to fix the back end, and as soon as I fix the back end, it's going to be a breaking change for the front end, or the front end is going to go crud up my database as soon as it starts up and syncs all its data back. So products like Intune give you the ability to do that kind of functionality. So Intune, oopsie, I guess I'm a couple of slides behind here. So Intune, again, it's a hosted application. It's part of the Office 365 suite. And it comes with a companion application on each one of the platforms. So really quick, we'll come over here and I'll do a quick browse around the Intune user interface so you can see how this is actually different from how we've done the app distribution for Hockey app. And since Intune is a very secure application, it reminds me every 5 minutes that I need to log in. So just give me 1 second here while the UI refreshes. And then what we'll do is we'll take a look at what's the user experience of the application itself. And spinning. Spinning. There we go. So within the dashboard, we can see the number of applications. We can see that there was an app installation issue error. So for one particular device, there was actually a problem installing the app on the device. So we can drill down into that kind of information. We can see more information about the devices that are under management. I can go search for devices. I can create new applications. And say, for example, within my apps, I can manage things like I mentioned that we can force deploy an application. So let's take the iOS application. If I click Manage Deployment here, Manage Deployment gives me the option to specify that for all of my users, I've currently set this as the app is being available for my devices. So there's other statuses there. Like I said, we can do required install, or not applicable for a certain set of users. So you have a lot more granular control, and that's around the management certificates that are also installed with the devices themselves. So that's just kind of a high-level view. There's lots of functionality inside Intune. But let's actually come over and look at what does that look like for the actual end users. So the end users within your organization, there's a certain amount of self-service here that gives them the ability to choose what they want to install and when. And so for each one of these devices, I install this app. It's called the Company Portal app. And you just get this from the public app store. So the Company Portal app will give you the ability to provision your device. So it allows users to enroll in. Once your Office 365 configuration has been connected up to your Intune instance, your administrator can say who can access what and where. And once my device is enrolled, I come back over and you see, I talked about earlier how you're actually going into your Safari window. This is going to give me a list of the applications that are actually available for me to install. So I'll just give these a second to complete signing in on each one of the platforms. Because of course, our Wi-Fi is a little bit slow here. Or we'll just move on because it's extremely slow. Here we go. These ones I can't plug into a fixed Wi-Fi. I can plug in my laptops to an actual hardwire, but these I have to wait for the Wi-Fi to load up. So again, you can see all the applications that are available to me. I can choose to install the applications on my device, but as an administrator, I have a lot more control over who has access to them and what. And so in the interest of time, just to make sure we have some Q&A. Oh, here we go. So we see here that my application has actually failed to install, so that was the alert that I saw earlier. And it's failed to install because I've been installing and uninstalling from the various mechanisms, and Intune doesn't know why the app is not there. So same thing, I go reinstall the application. It's going to allow me to actually install on that device, and we're just being a little bit slow on Wi-Fi here. So we'll come back around here to the actual slides themselves. So as we said, you get advanced device management with these types of approaches. You can control which application or which devices are allowed to do what they have access to, which apps can be downloaded and can be installed, pushing and pulling, enforcing policies across the devices, giving you a lot more control. And in the BYOD world, you need to be able to control on each of the individual devices. As I mentioned, Intune integrates directly in with Office 365. It's part of the Office 365 suite. So if you're already using that, it's actually a good way to get set up. And for all the content that I actually did for these individual sessions, this was fresh new content that I created from the ground up. I'm familiar with the content. I've helped a lot of customers who have worked through this process. But prior to this, I actually hadn't walked through these particular products myself. I'd spent time in other solutions. And these were things that I was actually able to get up and running in an afternoon. Getting into and working and getting my devices enrolled and starting setting up policies and distributing was a couple of hours worth of work. So it doesn't need to be something that is a big, large, massive project to actually get these things up and going. So kind of coming back around, we talked about distributing your applications. It is complex. There's lots of moving pieces. And if you're not aware of where all the moving pieces are, it does appear to be a really hard and painful process. But once you've actually nailed down what is my signing process, what tools am I going to use in which steps along the organization, it actually becomes a fairly easy process. It's not a hard process. You just have to make sure that you get the right steps in place. And again, if you're using automation tools to do all of this, you really don't notice a lot of it. It just becomes part of my developer commits code, and all of a sudden, I get an update from Hockey App. I get an email or I get a push notification from Hockey App that says you have a new version of the application to install. Your IT administrator gets that functionality, and then they can actually go take those exact same files, those exact same artifacts, and go push them out through Intune once they've actually certified the release. Awesome. Thank you.